So welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar live series. My name is Shay Awasanya, and I am the host of our webinars at Parsec. I'm glad that everyone could join us today. As we get started, we have a couple of quick housekeeping items. So the first one is that you will receive the recording of the webinar after it ends, and you will get a copy of the slides. And then we do encourage Q&A, so please use the Q&A to engage with everyone on the chat. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and then share your reaction. A little bit about today's webinar. So I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. McDonald at last year's conference in Chattanooga in Tennessee. And she presented about the work that she's going to be talking through today. And so I walked away from the session just feeling very moved by what she shared. And so it was clear that this was something that we wanted to share with our community. And so today she'll be talking about something that sits at the intersection of culture, identity and academic excellence, and how intentionally connecting those things in STEM classrooms can really be transformative for our students, especially minority students. And so, a little bit about her. She is an educator and a leader from Memphis, Tennessee. Her career has been defined by a deep commitment to equity and student success. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology, a Master's of Education, and a doctorate in Educational Leadership. And she began her teaching in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and has expanded her impact across K through 12 and adult education in Memphis. So we're really honored to have her today. She has a particular focus in increasing access to STEM experiences in urban communities. And beyond the classroom, she serves as the Youth and Development Committee Chair for the Memphis Urban League of Young Professionals, where she leads mentorship and youth empowerment initiatives. So, with that, we're really excited to have her join us today. Like I mentioned, she'll be walking us through cultural, responsive, and sustainable STEM practices. And we'll really give you practical strategies on how you can take it back to your classroom to help increase engagement within your students. So, with that, Dr. McDonald, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Shay. I really appreciate it. And thank all of you for being here with me today. I'm going to begin sharing my screen and we'll get into the content. Okay. Okay, is everybody able to see okay? Okay. So, as Shay mentioned, today I'll be presenting about culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices as an approach to promoting achievement in minority students. So, before we begin, I want us to sit with this reality. Only about 1 in 5 underrepresented minority students who begin college in STEM complete a degree in STEM. That statistic is more than a number. It represents brilliant minds, untapped innovation, and it also represents lost opportunity. So it tells us that the issue is not talent. Our students are capable, curious, and full of potential. So the real question we should ask ourselves are what happens within our educational systems that cause so many students to leave STEM pathways. So this reason and this question that we ask ourselves are why culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices matter. When we intentionally design learning experiences that honor students' identities, their cultures, voices, and lived experiences, we can begin to create spaces where they not only participate in STEM, but where they truly thrive. So, with that being said, again, my name is Dr. Melissa McDonald, and today we will be talking about these culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices and how they can help promote achievement in minority students. So, that is kind of a mouthful. So, for the purposes of this presentation, I will be referring to them as CRSP, as our culturally responsive and sustainable practices. So today's discussion, we will highlight 3 things. First, talking about exactly what are culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices. Our second thing we're going to discuss is traditional STEM curricula versus CRSP. Lastly, we'll be hitting on sustainability, and that couples with practical application of CRSP strategies and the promotion and equity and achievement. So first, before we get into the strategies, we have to have a foundational understanding of what CRSP is. So first, before we get into the definition, I just kind of want to know, and you can put it in the chat box, like what comes to mind when you think culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices? Just give me one or two things that you think about whenever you hear that phrase, and I'll give about 30 seconds or so, or 45 seconds ish, to put those things in there.
Dr. McDonald, we have a chat in there. So Marcelo said connect to student experiences.
Okay.
Amanda said appeal to student identity.
Okay. Those are definitely parts of it, big parts of it, actually. So, it, are we good? Well, is that all that's in there?
Yeah.
Good. We're
Yep.
good. Okay. Okay. Thank you all so much for sharing your input, and you both would be correct. So, CRSP. Okay, so these are teaching and learning approaches in STEM that are both inclusive of students' cultural identities and designed to support long-term social, environmental, and educational well-being of our students. Okay, so some examples include connecting lessons to students' communities, including diverse scientists and innovators, and using students' prior knowledge and lived experiences, as well as collaborative problem solving. So, as you can see on the slide, here are the the three pillars of CRSP. So, kind of what I just went through, and we'll get to the sustainability piece a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so first, defining the vision of CRSP is threefold. Okay, so despite decades of persistent academic achievement, no, of persistent academic gaps, achievement gaps, and opportunity gaps in STEM fields, disproportionately affecting minority students. That is the challenge, the persistent achievement gaps in STEM. Okay, that's the challenge. Now, the hypothesis, as stated before, the issue is not ability, it's simply relevance. Okay, so a lot of times traditional STEM curricula often fail to connect the concepts to students' lived experiences, histories, and cultural knowledge of minority students. And oftentimes that causes a disconnect, causing students consequently to disengage. Okay, and so our solution are culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices. That's the solution, the framework. Okay, so this framework moves beyond just responsiveness by ensuring our lessons are both relevant, not only culturally, but they also address sustainable challenges important to students' communities. Okay, so too often students of color are viewed through a deficit lens. Okay, I want to stay there for just a moment. A lot of times, our minority students are viewed through a deficit lens, and we have to shift that focus through an asset lens. What can they bring? What valuable experiences do they bring to the table? Okay, versus, well, what are they lacking? Okay, so CRSP shifts this to that asset mindset, and it recognizes the vast cultural and linguistic knowledge that they already have. So this is the vision of CRSP. Okay, so now I would like to take a few moments to delve into the details of traditional STEM versus CRSP. So, what are the differences between traditional STEM curricula and culturally responsive STEM curricula? Okay, so I have them outlined on, oops, sorry. We have them outlined on the table, broken down into sections. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back. I'm so sorry. Okay. So beginning with the focus of the instruction. Okay. So in traditional STEM curricula, most times, well, all the time, that we are focused on standards, concepts, and testable skills. Now, with that being said, we know that we have to teach according to the state mandated standards. Okay, whether it's culturally responsive or not, we have to teach according to those standards. Okay, so the second piece of the focus of instruction in a traditional STEM curricula is to just teach the lesson. Example, learning the water cycle. That's just an example. Now, in a culturally responsive environment, okay, we focus on the standards, of course, because that's the foundation, because we have to teach according to those. Okay, we focus on the standards plus students' identities, cultures, and lived experiences. So instead of just teaching the lesson, we're teaching the learner through the lesson. So an example of just versus learning the water cycle in a culturally responsive environment would be studying the water cycle through local flooding, water quality, or access issues in students' neighborhood. That's what that would look like in a culturally responsive STEM classroom. Okay, so the second category is the student roles in these different types of learning. Okay, so in a traditional STEM course, students, of course, they receive the information, they practice procedures, and complete teacher directed labs. Okay, versus in a culturally responsive environment, students are positioned as problem solvers, knowledge builders, and community contributors. So this can include investigating environmental concerns in their community, interviewing local stakeholders, designing solutions, and even contacting or being in touch with people that make decisions on their behalf. Okay, let me begin sharing again. Okay. All right. The third component to this is whose knowledge counts. Okay, so in a traditional STEM curricula, it's mostly textbook knowledge and dominant or Eurocentric scientific narratives. So we can shift in a culturally responsive environment. By a culturally responsive environment values multiple ways of knowing, such as community knowledge, family experiences, indigenous knowledge systems, and multilingual perspectives. So, as well as culturally grounded problem solving practices. Okay. So, with cultural responsiveness, we are not lowering the standards. Okay. We're just taking a different approach to addressing the standards and making it, presenting it in a way that students can use it in their own daily lives. And purpose of learning is the last category. So, with the purpose of learning, of course, in the traditional STEM curriculum, of course, we want to master standards and we want to prepare for these college and career exams, such as the ACT, the SAT, the ASVAB, and different things like that. Now, granted, I want to point out that those are very important high stakes exams that we need, to, of course, get to the next level. However, in a culturally responsive environment, the purpose of learning tends to shift toward environmental justice, public health disparities, transportation inequities, and energy sustainability. Okay, so with that being said, that ushers us into the last piece, which is sustainability, applying culturally responsive strategies and promoting equity and achievement. Okay. All right. So for sustainability, of course, this is going to be focused on local environmental and community needs. Okay. So, for example, I just took something that is very common in my community here of Memphis, Tennessee, and that is food insecurity. We're going to use it for purposes of this for this presentation. So addressing food insecurity is more than a humanitarian effort. It is a quintessential sustainable STEM practice. Why? Because it requires an interdisciplinary approach that balances technological innovation with long-term environmental health and social equity. So finally, just begin here. Okay. So sustainability, this is of course focused on local and environmental needs. So not sure if you were able to hear me at the time, but for purposes of this presentation, I'm using a problem that is widespread here in my community here in Memphis, which is food insecurity. So addressing food insecurity is more than a humanitarian effort. It's a quintessential sustainable STEM practice because it requires an interdisciplinary approach that balances technological innovation with long-term environmental health and social equity. So finding a solution to food insecurity is a sustainable practice also because it replaces linear consumption, which is the traditional take, waste, with circular innovation. Okay, so it forces the scientist or engineer or students to consider not just can we build it, but should we build it and will it help everyone forever? Meaning future generations. If we solve this problem of food insecurity, will it influence my community long term? Okay, so also with sustainability, it calls for increased agency and ownership. So the students, they do the research, they become community experts, as well as manufacturing those innovative solutions to solve this problem that affects them. Even if it doesn't affect them directly, it affects them indirectly because it probably will touch a family member or someone in the community that they know and that they value. Okay, and lastly, I spoke about interdisciplinary connections. So merging STEM with other subject areas, it merges STEM with other subject areas such as social justice and civics. So by finding solutions to these problems in their community, okay, they are essentially social advocates for their needs, and they are living up to their civic responsibility at young ages. So that is the sustainability piece of CRSP. All right. So I have some examples here, okay, of CRSP in action. These are curricular shifts. Okay, so shifting content from abstract theory to community action. So here are three examples. Three examples of how to rewrite curriculum units using the CRSP framework. Now, am I suggesting that you take your entire current curriculum and rewrite it all to be culturally responsive? No, that's not realistic. However, we can find a starting point by maybe choosing a few to make that curricular shift. So a traditional STEM unit, the first one that I have picked out here is a biochemistry unit, perhaps maybe in a high school, DNA structure and protein synthesis. So we could shift that to a culturally responsive and sustainable unit by decoding the diabetes crisis. We can analyze DNA roles alongside local consumption patterns, access to healthy foods, that includes food deserts. That ties into that food insecurity issue we just spoke about, and ancestral health knowledge. So all of those components would be addressed in the CRSP unit versus just learning about DNA structure and how protein is synthesized. Okay, so our second example is environmental science. Also, probably something that a student would take at a high school. The water cycle and pollution. Of course, that is taught in middle school classrooms as well. So instead of just teaching the water cycle, teaching about pollution, why it's bad, we can shift that to a CRSP unit called Designing for Stormwater Runoff. So, in this unit, students could collect water samples from local community streams and engineer green infrastructure prototypes to mitigate flooding and pollution in their neighborhood. This is something, of course, I just use Memphis as the example. I just chose things that our students here are affected by, and stormwater runoff is a big issue here. So that is how we could take learning about the basics of the water cycle and pollution and turning it into a more sustainable practice. And lastly, in a computer science course, in coding and algorithms, we have something called if then statements and loops. For any of my fellow computer science educators out there, you know what I'm talking about: if then statements and loops, such as while loops. Okay, we could turn that into just learning about them to a unit about bias detectives, auditing algorithms. So, using basic coding skills to test whether facial recognition software or AI tools work equally well across different skin tones and hair textures, discussing data bias that causes these failures. Now, this is something that is clearly connected to the lives of students. They have every kind of technology under the sun. So this would be something that affects minority students, of course, with the facial recognition, having it recognize different skin tones and hair textures. So these are all three good examples of how we can change traditional STEM units or science units and shift them to culturally responsive and sustainable units. So at this point, I have another question. Okay. So what are some ways that you can enhance curriculum units to reflect CRSP? And you can feel free to drop those in the chat box, please. Just think about something that you teach, or it doesn't have to be something that you teach, or just a topic. How could it be changed to reflect culturally responsive and sustainable units? So just take about 45 seconds to a minute and just drop some ideas in the chat box.
We have a comment. Dr. McDonald, I can read it out for you. Marcelo said, have parents of local community members present about a specific STEM-related topic.
Ooh, that would be great. I like that idea. Thank you so much for that comment. And of course, that is a way to get, parents involved in their children's education while promoting that civic responsibility also. So thank you so much for that. All right. So, okay. So let's talk about equity and achievements. One of the last pieces here, equity and achievement in STEM. So my next question, and this is one of the last ones that I will bother you with. What is the difference between equity and equality? What is the difference between equity and inequality? If you want to either come off mute or just put it in the chat, that is completely fine.
All right, there's a couple of comments. So Marcelo said, equality is giving everyone the same thing. Alice said, equity is leveling the field while equality is same treatment. And then Marcelo said, equity is
Mhm.
tailoring to their needs.
Yes, it is definitely tailoring to their needs. So as it really, and thank you all so much for those comments. Equity in STEM, well, specifically in STEM, of course, means ensuring that all students have fair access. It's essentially comes down to access, have fair access to resources, rigorous instruction, and support systems. So, again, not suggesting that we lower expectations for any students. However, equity in STEM is not simply about giving every student the same resources. It is about ensuring that minority students receive targeted support, representation, and culturally relevant learning experiences needed to achieve and thrive. So, for example, one thing that could help, just say you want to have a guest speaker come in, as we do a lot here in our STEM classes. We have speakers come in to say, for example, you have a medical doctor come in, maybe inviting someone in that looks like them, that they can identify with. Okay. So that's just one example of something that can help them relate, that also promotes equity. Okay, so minority students often face barriers such as limited access to advanced STEM courses, underrepresentation in STEM fields, implicit bias and low expectations, and the lack of culturally responsive teaching. Achievement gaps may appear in the form of test scores, advanced placement enrollment, as well as STEM degree persistence. Now, culturally responsive STEM instructions, of course, it helps improve engagement, academic performance, STEM identity, and career readiness. Now, in my own experience, I can say when students work towards something that affects them, that increases engagement substantially. They tend to care a lot more about the content and about the way they're being taught. Once they connect, once they connect with the lesson, knowing that it's something that affects them in their community, they tend to be a lot more motivated to complete the work. Okay. Okay. So wrapping up, okay. So call to action from achievement gap to opportunity bridge. Okay. So I did want to mention one more thing. Achievement gaps versus opportunity gaps, right? So what are the differences between the two? Would anyone like to call any of those differences out? What is the difference between an opportunity gap and an achievement gap?
I think achievement has to do more with test scores and how
Mm-hmm.
our students are performing.
Right.
Opportunity, I think, has to do with what experiences we're giving our students, if we're even
Mm-hmm.
providing them opportunities to take some of these courses, like on the previous slide,
Mm-hmm.
if we're expecting them to also, go after those more rigorous and tougher courses, especially in math and science.
Mm-hmm.
Just a guess on
Yeah.
that one.
Okay, thank you so much for that. That is exactly right. Just being given the opportunity that oftentimes they're denied. Okay. So like we spoke about at the beginning, it's not about ability at all. A lot of times it's about access. Okay. So we're going to summarize the framework and we're going to talk about some next steps. So the CRSP framework, essentially tying everything up, what we talked about today: relevant, rigorous, and rooted in community. Those are components of culturally responsive and sustainable STEM practices. Okay, so Action step number one, audit your curriculum. Okay. Go through your curriculum with it, whichever one you teach. Identify one unit you currently teach that can be swapped for a local sustainable problem. Okay. Um, and the next thing after that is establish community partnerships. Connect your classroom to local activists, engineers, or community elders. And one thing I've also found in my experience is that community partners they want to help. They they want to contribute to education in their community. Okay, so once you kind of put it out there, people will be more than willing to come in and help you in your class. Okay, so I'll leave you with this question. What is the first barrier you will commit to breaking down in your STEM classroom? Now, I do realize that everybody may not be STEM educators, so we'll just say breaking down in your classroom. Okay. Um, you don't have to answer this now. I just kind of want you to think on that as you move forward in your planning, whether it's planning for the end of this year, which I know everyone at this point in the year in quarter four, getting ready for state testing and different activities going on. So maybe it's something you might want to commit to thinking about for the upcoming school year. Okay. So, and as I close, I'll leave you with this. The future of STEM depends on how well we prepare all learners today. By centering culture, equity, and sustainability, we move from teaching the content to transforming lives and communities. So, once again, my name is Dr. Melissa McDonald, and I appreciate your time and you sharing your inputs and interacting and engaging with me today. Thank you so very much. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Shay